For having me speak today to the organizing committee, to Yaya. I'd like to thank Prem Fort for walking around with this yesterday. I didn't even notice it was here at the podium. So this gives me freedom. I can walk around. So thank you for that. We learn something every day. So the title of the talk is meant to be intriguing. Age is just a number. Sweden, Volvos, and really tiny babies. Things that don't really seem to go together. Very soon, I hope, you'll figure out how this all comes together, and I hope you enjoy the talk. Oh, Prem, it's not working. Okay. Well, I still admire you for showing me how it works. Actually, am I using the wrong button? Does this work? Oh, it was off. There we go. Okay. So I have no financial conflicts to disclose. So the purpose of this talk is really twofold. We're going to understand the outcomes from our center's decision to embark on resuscitation at 23 weeks. You're going to see some pitfalls, and we're going to examine some strategies to optimize outcomes at 22 and 23 weeks. Interestingly, looking at the schedule for today, there are some complementary talks coming. So I think there's a bit of a theme today. So as has been mentioned before, I'm the chair of the Fetus and Newborn Committee. In 2015, I was on the committee when the following statement came out having to do with, or following guideline, having to do with how to approach basically the edge of viability in terms of perinatal consultation. And what the statement said at that time was at 22 weeks, since survival is uncommon, a non-interventional approach is recommended with a focus on comfort care. And at 23 and 24 weeks, active treatment is appropriate for some infants. The CPS Fetus and Newborn Committee came under extreme fire for this. Very, very angry neonatologists in Canada. There was a letter put together by Dr. Barrington. I don't know how many of you know Dr. Keith Barrington. He was the lead of it. And it was signed by some of my own colleagues, who were upset that we had taken such a dogmatic, approach to say, here's okay and here's not. One of the issues was that some studies were beginning to suggest, and one of them was Canadian, well, Epicure was not, but Sinus, it works in Vancouver, and Sinus. And what these studies were finding is that at 23 to 25 weeks, there really wasn't any difference in outcome. So whether you were 23 weeks, 24, 25 weeks, should you survive? So survival is different, we know that. But should you survive, when you look at the long-term outcomes of these babies, they don't appear to be different. Okay, and that's an important point. So in 2017, under immense pressure, we decided to revise the statement. And I'm very proud of this current statement. I was about to become chair, just thankfully I wasn't chair when this was released. But we revised the statements 2 years after it was released. And this time what we did was we had parents on the committee. We had, for the first time, when we were creating a guideline, we had a national representation in the sense that we sent drafts of this, embargoed of course, to some key stakeholders in terms of neonatologists across the country and said, what do you think? Have we hit the mark, or are we still missing it? And so this document was really motivated to say, in essence, it said, look, this is a complicated decision. We're not going to be so prescriptive and say, do it here, don't do it here. It's about shared decision making with the family. And really what motivated us was, in part, this table. This was looking at severe to moderate disability at 4 to 8 years of age. And when you looked at the evidence for this, and this was some pooled evidence from some studies, you could see, although we only have small numbers, 12 babies at 22 weeks, what you find here is, and it's on the bottom here, most children have no or mild neurodevelopmental disability, with estimates of 57% at 22 weeks. 57% do not have significant disability. At 23 weeks, it's 60%. So if you're going to say that it's okay at 23 weeks, but it's not okay at 22 weeks, you're very hard pressed to actually say that that's factual, that that's based on science, okay? So I'm not going to read all of this out because Yaya will hit me with the flag very soon and say you're going to have no time. But I'm just going to summarize the main points here. So these are the key recommendations that came out of the statement. Number one is basically, if you're between 22 to 25 weeks and you're in a peripheral community that does not have level 3 care, really try to get them as the mother to a level 3 hospital. Number two, we owe it to families to be able to have a face-to-face discussion with an obstetrician and a neonatologist, ideally, who are on the same page. So get the neonatologist, get the obstetrician to talk before you give mixed messages to the family. Number three, we talked about yesterday, a brilliant talk about, counseling, in which he talked about the importance of using either center-specific or regional or country-specific data when you have it, so that you're not just giving opinion, so that you're not having, if I go in, because I'm on call, I give one opinion. If Yaya's on, he gives a different opinion. You want consistency. So you have to, if you use data to back your recommendations, you'll be consistent. And then the final point, which is probably the most important point, is to use the shared decision-making model. Find out what the values are for the family. What are their interests? What's their background? How many times have they tried to get pregnant? Is this a precious pregnancy? They're all precious, but is this one more precious because mom and dad have tried for 10 years to get pregnant? So that all factors in, right? Okay, now I'm going to challenge your brains a little, because this is something we all do, or some of us do. But there's a big problem with numbers. And this is one of the motivating reasons why saying 22 weeks is okay, or sorry, not okay, but 23 weeks is okay, actually makes no sense, okay? And one of the reasons is, this is from ACOG, the American College of Obstetric and Gynecology, mentioned in a paper in 2017, that when you think about the last menstrual period, it's not an exact science, okay? Women ovulate at different times. It's on average 28 days. But the problem is many women don't actually remember when their last menstrual period was, okay? And so, if they're trying and they're tracking it, of course they do, but many women don't, okay? We have variability in timing of ovulation. When you take all of that into account, the best estimate, which I have down here, we always say a first trimester ultrasound, known last menstrual period is the best way to know what the gestational age is, but that's still plus or minus 5 to 7 days. So if a woman comes in at 22 and 6 and you say, I'm sorry, you're a day shy of 23, our policy says 23, there's no way that you know for sure she's not actually 23 and 4, okay? So it would be unfair of us to be that specific. The other thing, and I've said this to my trainees, because we actually did have a policy or guideline that said we resuscitated 23 weeks and up. And I would say, what about the woman who shows up at 10 p.m. at 22 and 6? Are you really going to say, I'm not resuscitating that baby because, well, I've got 2 more hours until I'm allowed to do so? No, it's silly. We know that. But that's why we should actually not think about numbers. The numbers trap us. Now, health equity. So what I mean by this slide is, we've all seen this. You have a guideline that says, don't resuscitate at this, do resuscitate at this. And the family looks at you and says, doctor, please, please. So if I'm on, because I'm a very soft guy, I resuscitate. If Prem's on, Prem might say, I'm sorry. This is not happening. I'm just kidding. So this slide's meant to be a bit humorous in some ways. In North America, I've used this slide before, and there's a common joke called, we say a priest, a rabbi, and an imam walk into a bar. It's a joke, but the idea being, what I'm meaning to show here is, regardless of your faith, regardless of your religion, that faith, as I'm going to show you in a few minutes, matters tremendously to outcome. Okay, so faith matters tremendously. The middle slide says small baby unit. Southern California has some small baby units. Toronto has experimented at Sunnybrook Hospital in Toronto has experimented with small baby units. So the idea is having within your unit a team of dedicated nurses, respiratory therapists, doctors who only care for these 22 to 25 weeks. So you have a small pool for consistency. And then practice makes perfect. If you've read Malcolm Gladwell's work, where he talks about the 10,000 hour rule, that, the more, if you do things for 10,000 hours, you get really proficient at it. Same idea. If you're doing, the more babies you see at 22, 23, 24 weeks, the better you get, okay? So let's talk about data, because I know everyone always likes to say, well, what does the data show? So these are my own slides that I created using Canadian Neonatal Network data. That's a grouping of 33 NICUs across the country that submits data like the Vermont Oxford Network. And I'm sure there's networks elsewhere in different countries from where people are from. So I took their annual reports, I put the data all together, because when you're talking about small numbers, you want to see 3 years. You don't as a minimum of outcome, because 1 year can go this and this and this. But what you're seeing here is these are survival to discharge, including delivery room deaths from 2018 to 2020. So this is the most recent data we have out of the Canadian Neonatal Network. And what you can see is when the blue line is survival with active care. So at 22 weeks, it's about 30% in Canada. By the time you get to 23, it's about 40%. So even survival is not hugely different, 30 to 40%, okay? And we're just gonna get better with time. Now, if you look at survival to discharge with active care, including delivery room deaths, sorry, I'm showing the same thing, just the yellow highlight there. But when you look, what happens if you make it to admission? Making it to admission is really interesting. Again, 22 weeks is 40% survival, 45% at 23 weeks. So I hope I'm making the case to you that this really does matter. If you believe, this is on admission. So if they make it out of the case room, their survival, predicted survival, is about 40% at 22 weeks, 45% at 23 weeks. You can see at 24 weeks, it does jump, okay? But I'm just trying to really get your mind around the idea that there's not this magic wall between 22 and 23 weeks. They're actually not that dissimilar. Now, what do we know about outcomes? Because I know people in the audience are saying, yes, doctor, but what about how they do? Okay, I'm going to shock you. Now, part of this is because Canada is very cold, right? And we know that cooling preserves brain function. So I think that take these results with a grain of salt, because we have some very good results. Okay. So we don't know much, because I will disclose before I show you any of this, I actually have no data on 22 weeks. I have data on 23 weeks that I'm going to show you, which is really good. And I'm going to show you that I think, based on the other info, I believe that the data for 22 won't be much different. Why don't I have data? It's not that I'm lazy. It's not that I couldn't find the data. Well, it actually is that I couldn't find the data. We don't have the data, because we just, remember, the statement for resuscitating 22 weeks came out in 2017. It's going to take time for units to start doing that. This is data from 2018, 2019. So we just didn't have the numbers yet. But without further ado, by the way, CNFUN stands for the Canadian Neonatal Follow-Up Network. Okay, ready to have your minds blown? Because when I saw this data, I was shocked. Because if you had said to me, you know, if somebody walked up and said, what is the likelihood of cerebral palsy? What's the likelihood of developmental delay in a baby who's born at 23 weeks? I would have said, oh, dude, almost all of them are going to have a problem. But here's our own data in Canada. So you can see at 23 weeks, this is percentage with cerebral palsy. All comers is only 13%. 13% with cerebral palsy. When you talk about severe cerebral palsy, it's in the neighborhood of about 4%. Okay, 4 out of every 100 babies at 23 weeks will have severe CP. And the number, again, it goes down at 24 weeks, and not dramatically, not hugely different. Visual impairment, we are always scared of ROP, and we should be. But the percentage of babies that have visual impairment, significant visual impairment, and bilateral, is about 6%. Okay, so I would argue those numbers are really good. What about the Bailey 3 cognitive and Bailey 3 motor? Again, well, they're worse. They're worse certainly than the other data, but you're talking about numbers in the range of about 30 to 35% at 23 weeks. So I'm guessing it's going to be about 40%, if I had to guess. Have me back at some point and I'll give you the data on the next time. But I think we're probably going to be in the range of about 40%. The motor score is same, about 40 to 50%. So it's not guaranteed that these children will be sick, okay, and have long-term outcomes. And we know from the slide that I presented from our statement that about 50 to 55% of these babies, 57% exactly, will at 22 weeks do not have long-term deficits, significant long-term deficits. This slide I can now update with another star. I presented some of this data for Grand Rounds last year in my city. And at the time, I did a national survey with my contacts across the country to find out who is already resuscitating 22 weeks. And what I discovered are the yellow stars are all the centers that are resuscitating 22 weeks. We were the only ones in Canada that were not resuscitating at 22 weeks. So just to give you an idea of what Canada is doing, it's fairly standard now. Not every center has guidelines that says they resuscitate, but it's fairly standard. Okay, everybody's been wondering, how does he tie Volvos into a talk about premature babies? Okay, so I've owned many Volvos. I think they're great cars. I don't currently own one. I don't have any financial relationship with Volvo. Make up your own mind if you want to buy one or not. But what I do love about Volvo is they've got some great sayings. Okay, they're slogans. And I think they were built for preterm slogans. Now, Volvo, they're boxy, but they're good. Has nothing to do with premature babies, but I just love that old slogan. But what about Volvo for life? Let's resuscitate some babies, okay? Now, even better, because we like quality, we like better. Volvo for life is the current one, redefining perfection, right? And that's where we want to go. Okay, so now, other than being sort of cheeky about Volvos, why am I even bringing Volvos up? It's because Volvos are made in Sweden. Okay, so this hospital on the left is Uppsala Hospital and University in Sweden. The hospital on the right is Nationwide Children's in, I believe it's Ohio, isn't it? Yeah. So Nationwide is second behind Prem's Hospital in the United States. So very close second. But the idea here was, this was a wonderful study done in 2018, I believe it was. And what they did was they said, hey, let's compare outcomes between Sweden that has a universal positive approach to resuscitation at 22 weeks and 23 weeks with Nationwide Children that has a selective approach. Now, remember what I said, practice makes perfect and faith matters most, okay? And I'm about to show you the evidence. So they looked at how do babies do between these two hospitals. And by the way, all joking aside, Nationwide Children's, great respect, major hospital in the US, very important hospital, okay? But let's look at the outcomes. Survival. Getting out of the delivery room, 95% survival in Uppsala versus 75% in Nationwide Children. So just making it out of the room, different. Just the p-value, I know we can get into a debate about p-values, but the p-value was just significant. 24-hour survival, 93% versus 56%, almost double. And by 1 year, 53% versus 19%. More babies are surviving in Sweden that are comparable, and I don't have the time to go through all the data, but they were comparable. More babies are surviving. So does your faith matter most? Okay. One of the things, if Yaya may remember when he would do rounds with me, I'm always positive. And one of the reasons I'm positive is because I believe firmly that if you as a leader are positive, when you lead rounds, everybody around you is positive and they pay attention to things and they do more gases or they pay more attention to the gas. They look at the electrolytes. Whereas when you start to talk about how this baby has no chance, people start reacting more slowly to things. They don't do as frequent testing, right? So I think that that's what's going on here to a certain degree. Part of it is experience, because when you look at the numbers, the comprehensive center had 21 babies. The selective center had only 6, okay? This is sort of in the outcomes. But when you look at the outcomes, some things stick out, like severe head injury, 67% in Nationwide Children's in this group. I know the numbers are small, 10% in Uppsala. And then unimpaired patients, 55% in neurologically, 55% in, thank you, 55% in Uppsala versus 0 made it out without neurological injury. So that's, to me, very interesting, okay, that practice and faith have something to do with it. Now, when we look at the follow-up study to this, which was published in 2021, what the Swedes decided to do is they said, hey, let's look at what we did over all this time, 2006 to 2015. Let's see what sort of data we can get out of this. And this has to be, to my knowledge, one of the biggest data sets that we'll have, because you don't have very many studies with 44 babies at 22 weeks when you can look at outcomes. So given that I've had the 5-minute flag, I'm just going to move on to not go through that. But what I am going to show you is hospital outcomes by survivors, because this to me is shocking. Okay. Now, I'm going to even say we may even be better now than we were back in 2006 because of different advances and so forth. But when you look at the far right, you look at p-values for things like ROP treatment, NEC, PDA surgery, IVH3, 4, PVL, severe BPD, by and large, between 22, 23, and 24 weeks, there's no difference. Okay. Now, I've said that already. I said that at the start of the talk, that the outcomes are not that different between 22, 23, and 24 weeks if you survive. If people are free, well, this will be recorded, so you can look back at this slide after. I've given you the reference as well. But the numbers themselves are low. Okay. Again, these are, I would say IVH grade 3 to 4, would anyone have predicted that it was only 9%, 2 out of 23 babies at 22 weeks in Uppsala? To me, that is remarkable. That there's roughly 10%. PVL also 22% at 22 weeks. I would have predicted it would be higher if you just asked me for my opinion. When you look at developmental outcomes, and this is what really matters, right? How do these kids do in the long run? No different. Okay, they all seem to, by and large, there's a few small little differences, but by and large, 22 to 24 weeks in Uppsala, Sweden, the percentages are low. Just as an example, 24 weeks moderate to severe visual impairment, 10%, very much the same as what I showed you in Canada at 23 weeks. Moderate to severe hearing or moderate hearing impairment, 1 baby had hearing impairment. I mean, that's remarkable. What does ACOG say? Because this is important. So the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, I like to spread it around Canada, US. So in the ACOG, actually the reason I'm using ACOG is because Canada does not have a statement at 22 weeks. But ACOG in September of 2021 basically said, give steroids at 22 weeks. Because that's one of the questions that I know people may have is, should we be giving steroids or not? The American College does say, look, we're taking an active approach at 22 weeks. It makes sense to give these babies the best shot. And we know that steroids are very likely to help and unlikely to harm significantly compared to being born without the protective effect of steroids. So in conclusion, I'm just going to talk about speaking to the family. I'm going to breeze through this because, quite honestly, the talk yesterday did a much better job than I would do. But before approaching the family, it is important. And it's just, I say to my students, it's like parenting children. Make sure that you're on the same page, right? Before you make a decision about your children, before you make a decision about what you're going to say to the family, speak to your obstetrician. Make sure that they agree with what you're about to do. Also, how certain are they of the gestational age? Okay, because that becomes really important. Other factors like, is this a small baby? Is this a big baby? Has there been steroids? Is it multiple gestations? Is there chorioamnionitis? All of these things matter. Remember I said, be very specific as possible, data-driven. So if you know the outcomes, for example, for babies at 22 and 23 weeks who are born through chorio, and you know that that increases the risk of CP by 2 times, I'd share that with the family, if they're concerned, about trying to make that decision. During the antenatal consults, it's okay to talk about obviously comfort care. That's part of what we do, right? So we can say active care, comfort care. The recommendation is that we only offer intensive care if they're in, like if a 22-weeker was born in a rural place in Manitoba with, 1 nurse and no doctors and no equipment, we would simply say, we're very sorry if we couldn't get you to a tertiary care center. And the other thing is, and we've talked about this as well, about golden hour. That was a great talk. I don't know if she's here, but in any event, about the golden hour and pre-delivery checklist, preparing, making sure everybody knows, where are you standing? What are you doing? Who's putting in the lines? Who's leading the resuscitation? How fast are we going to get that baby to the NICU? All of these things are important. So in conclusions, and I thank you for your time, and I'm sorry if I'm like a minute or 2 over, but the outcomes for these infants are not as bad as you might think. Now, I've made an assumption here that you think the outcomes were poor, but they're maybe not as bad as some of you might have thought. I've talked to you about the power of belief. The key to success is believing you can do it and preparing your team comprehensively. And I do believe this because I am an optimist. I do believe that as we get better at what we do, as we dedicate ourselves to this craft, and as we dedicate ourselves to the parents and keep the parents in the center of the decision making, we will only get better. So thank you for your time.